The afternoon had the stale sweetness of overripe fruit when my lower back finally gave out, and I moved through my little house like a woman balancing a bowl of water on her head. I told myself I only needed $5 for a small bottle of pain cream and some tablets to carry me through the worst of it. My sons had always said to call if I needed anything, so I sent a short message to each of them and set the phone down, imagining the tiny kindness of a shared errand. I did not expect the front door to swing open as if the wind itself were furious, nor that my eldest daughter-in-law would stride in first. Voice sharpened to a blade. She came with the posture of a person who believed the house belonged to her whenever she was angry. And in the span of a few heartbeats, I was no longer a mother or a woman with pain. Only an obstacle accused of playing favorites, of performing poverty to provoke pity, of running a secret economy where my two younger sons thrived while the eldest starved on principle. What followed was not an argument so much as a storm. The second daughter-in-law arrived with the grim conviction of someone who had been collecting slights for years, and the youngest trailed the others, sobbing as if the end of a marriage were a door she meant to slam so hard it would never open again. I listened, stunned and small, to accusations about oranges that were too expensive for a woman who claimed she could not spare $5. About bowls knocked to the floor and chairs raised like hammers over furniture I had cleaned 1,000 times. I wanted to hold up my palms and remind them that my monthly check, $2,000, did not sleep long in my account because I split it evenly among 3 households, because I watched their children from morning to dusk, because I cooked and scrubbed and folded and picked up after illnesses and tantrums and the scattered trails of growing families. At 8:20 p.m., I pushed a dented food cart into the night market, selling corn tortillas and tacos until 1:00 a.m., or sometimes 2:00 a.m. Then came home to 4 hours of sleep before the day began again. I did it for decades because love, to me, had always been a verb with bruised feet. But pain unties old knots. That evening, I touched my back and felt, with an animal clarity, that every promise I had made to stay useful was burning away. I had already bought a bus ticket for 3 days later Willowbrook, the town that had once pronounced my name with affection, and as the first wave of shouting crested and broke, I thought of tall pines and a quiet street, and a version of myself that had not yet learned to apologize for taking up space. By the time the door slammed and the house held only the sound of my own breathing, I knew that leaving would be my one generous act for myself. I told my eldest, when he came in later, that the orange had been a gift from a friend and that I had wanted them all to taste something sweet. He did not hear the sentence so much as the problem it failed to solve. I did not mention that he had once paid more than $200 for a back brace for his wife's mother, because comparisons are traps that keep us from seeing the truth. The truth was simple. I had built 3 houses on the same street with my night market money and my stubbornness. I had given everything I thought love demanded. Still, somehow, I had become an inconvenience. I sat on the edge of my bed beneath the dim lamp and stared at the bus ticket glowing like a small moon on my phone screen and knew, with a clarity that hurt more than my spine, that I was going home. The next morning the phone rang, and in each call there was an expectation braided with complaint. No one asked how I had slept or whether I could bend without wincing. Instead, there were schedules to explain and blame to distribute, because a child had not been dropped at school on time, and a meeting had been missed, and a boss had been angered. My sons were not cruel men, They were simply people who had grown used to a world in which I was the oil that kept every hinge from squealing. I told them the doctor had warned me to remain in bed for months, unless I wanted the dull ache to become something that could make a leg go numb forever. My eldest made a soft sound in his throat, the kind people make when they agree with you only to move on. The second asked if I was not already wearing pain patches, as though a strip of medicine could replace the work of two bent hands. The youngest went straight to the question of money, requesting whatever remained in my account because cash, in his words, could settle the present better than any promise about the future. That night, the pain cresting through my spine woke me before 3:00 a.m., and I lay flat, willing myself to breathe through it. When the door opened, it was my eldest granddaughter, 9 years old. A child I had lifted from her crib on nights when her mother could not be woken by gentle knocks. She stood like a small angel with her hands clasped and explained that her mother was upset because I had not set up the cart and it had been her night to take the earnings. I knew the ledger the daughters-in-law kept 10 nights each month promised to each of them, with adjustments when the calendar favored one and a running tally of who had been shorted an hour here or there. It had begun as a favor and become a ritual asset division, something to be enforced with cold arithmetic. I tried to tell the child that pain is not a rebellion, only a body asking for mercy. But she was learning the numbers that run a household and simply repeated what she had overheard. Soon after, my eldest son's wife returned, and the house filled again with the scratchy sound of someone certain she had been wronged. She demanded the cart be pushed to its usual spot by 8:00 p.m., and the children set to their usual baths by 7:30 p.m., and the vegetables chopped by 6:00 p.m., because a single disruption had rippled through her day like a stone thrown into a narrow pond. When I said, calmly, that I could not rely on her later if I could not rely on her kindness now, something sharp flickered through her eyes, as if I had broken one of the private commandments of our family. Threats emptied themselves into the air, old vows of divorces spoken and retracted like spells cast without conviction. My eldest son came to the door with a face so tense I could see the years pushing against his jawline. He asked why I had to make everything so difficult. I asked why he believed difficulty bloomed from my refusal to pretend I was well. When he left, the door bang rang like a metal bowl struck with a ladle. The next day, I visited Laura, the woman who had shared a vendor stall with me for nearly 20 years, who could prep a stack of masa with her eyes closed and her mouth full of gossip. I told her I needed to leave, and that I had no savings because love had taught me generosity without a halting point. She did not laugh at that. She called her niece and said there was an old house worth more than it cost because its bones were strong. We sat at my kitchen table and drew up papers. They paid $150,000, far less than the neighborhood would command from someone who wanted to tear down and build new. And I opened a bank account that did not share its name with any promise I did not intend to keep. When the money arrived, it looked quiet on the screen, like a lake without wind. I withdrew $20,000 in cash for the mayor in Willowbrook to hire trusted hands and buy materials, and I told him I wanted a small house that welcomed morning light and did not resent old knees. That night, I packed without reverence. A few clothes and documents, the sewing scissors my mother had insisted I keep sharp. At 5:00 a.m., I stepped into a taxi and did not look back at the houses I had once polished like awards. Sometimes, departure is the closest thing a woman gets to applause. The bus hummed like a long, low lullaby, and a young traveler with freckles and an easy smile offered me bread as if kindness were the most natural language on earth. She spoke about video platforms and creators she adored, using phrases I barely understood, and I considered how little my own sons had revealed about the worlds that lived on their screens and timelines. How rarely I had been invited to like, to comment, to subscribe to their lives. 10 hours later. Willowbrook greeted me with air that smelled of pine resin and damp soil. The old cafe where I had once poured coffee during the breakfast rush had a new name, but the bell above the door still made the same polite chime when a customer entered. The house where I had rented a room in my 20s was half collapsed, a skeleton with weeds for ribs. I did not feel sorrow looking at it. I felt confirmation that time is a patient sculptor. The mayor, Mr. Hawkins, had not changed much except for a gentler voice and slower steps. When I explained what I wanted, he nodded a dozen times and said that good hands still lived in Willowbrook, and they would build a porch as wide as my size. Meanwhile, I slept in a narrow room behind the town hall. Woken each morning by the shuffle and cough of custodians who remembered my name from long ago and called me by it as if we were resuming a conversation. Not starting anew. My phone, which in the city had been a leash, became an echo chamber of messages that could not change my mind. My sons wanted schedules restored, tempers soothed, children tended, and the cart reopened at 8 p.m. Their wives messaged as if I had stolen a shift from each of them, and they were simply petitioning to have it returned. I wrote one sentence in the family group labeled "All for Mom" and felt my heartbeat settle as I pressed send from now on. The relationship was over, and I would be removing and blocking their numbers. The words did not tremble. They were a bridge burned, and I stood on my side of the river watching the glow reflect in the water. In the afternoons, I walked to Nor Hill and chose 2 small rectangles of ground. One I would give to vegetables that did not complain when harvested. The other I would fill with a garden I could tend without apologies. I wanted roses whose thorns would surprise me, and lavender whose scent could turn a hard day into a manageable one. Morning glories that would remind me not all doors are made of wood. When the crew began to raise brick and roof, I sat on the stoop and sorted seeds as if I were counting prayers. The house rose quickly, square by square, until there was a front porch wide enough to sit in the blue hour and think about nothing at all. After I moved in, the first dinner I cooked in the small kitchen tasted like a memory-remade beans slow-cooked with herbs from the yard. Tortillas pressed by my own hands and griddled until they puckered. In the quiet that followed, the old hunger inside me, the one that always asked what else I could do for others, slowly learned to ask what I could do for myself. I bought a used video camera from a man who swore it had filmed 3 weddings and 1 high school talent show. I set it on a stack of books and talked to it like a neighbor leaning over the fence. In the mornings, I filmed the way morning light touched my roses. In the afternoons, I recorded my hands stitching aprons on a revived Singer machine that had been asleep until I cleaned it for 3 days straight. In the evenings, I braided short edits together and posted them on a channel I called Granny Grace's Garden. Not because I clung to the grandmother title, but because it had become my armor. Followers arrived like birds that had learned a new migration path, first a few hundred, then thousands. And one day, a number that made me set the phone down and laugh alone in my kitchen from joy tinged with disbelief. People asked how to root cuttings, how to salt the pot just enough for a stew to sing, how to quiet a house that felt loud with worry. I answered, not as a saint or a martyr, but as a woman who had finally put the oxygen mask over her own mouth before helping others. The first wave of pressure did not come from my sons. It arrived in the shape of videos filmed by other hands and sent from accounts with names I did not recognize. There were my grandchildren on screen, cheeks flushed and eyes wide. repeating lines someone had asked them to say that breakfast had not arrived for 2 days, that laundry sat waiting and the cold crept in, and that the shouting had gotten worse since I left. It hurt to watch their small throats carry the burdens of adults. And yet I blocked the accounts without ceremony. Survival, at my age, meant learning the difference between compassion and surrender. Not long after, a voice I knew too well, Thomas, breath catching on each apology, like a man tripping on a loose rug, called from a number that had managed to slip past my filters. He said he did not care if I screamed as long as I came back, that a family was dissolving in his hands like paper left in water. I stared out the window at lavender spiking under the noon sun and said a sentence I never imagined I would say. I was no longer his mother. Not because I hated him, but because the version of me he required could no longer be returned to service. After I hung up, my knees shook, but I did not sit down. I went out to the porch, took in air that smelled clean enough to drink, and reminded myself that grief can masquerade as weakness when it is actually courage refusing to pretend. That would have been the end of it if guilt did not travel in caravans. Just before the winter holidays, my 3 sons arrived in Willowbrook as if the town were a stage and they intended to perform a reunion. Their wives stood beside them, faces arranged into contrition as delicate as icing. The grandchildren, always quick studies in adult weather, clustered like sparrows. Gifts were placed at my feet as if wrapping paper were an argument. Each speech was carefully composed youthful mistakes, words spoken in heat and regretted in the soft dark, pledges of new beginnings if I would only come back to the old routine. There was a moment, I admit, when the sound of a child calling me grandma in the cold air pressed hard on the cage of my ribs. But I had learned to distinguish between hunger and habit. I told them I had severed the tie, that I would not return, that my life in this small place was good not because it was easy, but because it was finally mine. Shock rearranged their features in a way I will remember until my last day. They did not scream. They turned, spoke to the priest and the grocer and the mayor in turn, asking each to convince me. But a town that had watched me as a young woman, a wife with secrets, and a mother with too many jobs had no appetite for a drama it had already seen. And when word spread that I would not bend, even the most talkative respected the border I had drawn. One afternoon, Michael fell to his knees and wrapped his arms around my legs, repeating apologies and explanations that wove together like cords. He said he lived in a middle place between wife and mother, pulled in 2 directions until the sheathing wore thin, and he asked me to let it go because he was tired. I told him I had spent decades being tired in ways I never put into words. It was not a contest of exhaustion, only a question of responsibility. He stood slowly, as if the knowledge had weight. When Lisa confessed that life had become chaos and asked me to return to tame it, I laughed without malice and reminded her I had once lived the chaos she described, multiplied by 3, and had called it ordinary. I closed the door with a certainty I wanted them to hear in the last click of the lock. Then slept for a full night without waking. Morning brought the second wave public judgment, swift and wide. The 3 daughters-in-law had posted a carefully edited montage shivering at my doorstep in thin clothing, children tugging sleeves for warmth, captions built to ignite indignation. The title asked whether a mother-in-law's heart could be so cold. Comments multiplied like dandelions, many of them from strangers who understood the world only by the performative cruelty on their screens. They followed and scolded, a strange duet of attention and condemnation. I adjusted my account settings so that only followers could comment, watched as the tide rushed in, and then did what I had learned to do in markets under hostile weather: set my canopy, secure my inventory, and wait out the storm without giving away what was not for sale. I wrote a statement and posted it without fretting over commas. I said the relationship with the 3 women had ended. That forgiveness is not owed to those who mistake a doorbell for a battering ram and a grandmother for a servant. I said I did not live for the spectacle, that my dignity was not an algorithm. The town noticed, because towns are living organisms built of news and rumor. And perhaps that helped keep the peace. In my house, I returned to the routine that was not a performance. I filmed the morning when frost crusted the lavender and made it crackle under my fingertips. I pressed dough and let it rest. I sewed aprons with deep pockets because every woman I had ever loved had needed a place to tuck a note, a key, a flower. Orders began to arrive from people who did not want to own my labor so much as wear a piece of my steadiness. Someone asked for a table runner stitched with tiny oranges, and I added it to the design with a smile so private it felt like a prayer. When the first snow came down hard, the garden folded itself into sleep, and I learned how to make soups that tasted like gratitude. Through it all, I kept waiting for the sorrow to punch through, for a scream to break loose. Instead, what rose in me was something quieter, a steady hum of relief, without the calendar carved by other hands. Time moved like a stream I could step into and out of. I walked to the post office and laughed with the clerk about packages with ribbons still caught in the tape. I met a retired teacher who traded me compost for a loaf of bread and a story about her childhood on a farm. I wrote down recipes and then crossed out half the words because simplicity often reads as wisdom when you have paid dearly for it. At night, I sometimes dreamed of my sons as the boys they had been, cheeks dirty from climbing trees, the pride in their eyes when they presented me with a bent nail they had hammered straight. I woke with the ache of love that is not enough to retry what has already failed. People like to pretend that choosing oneself is an act of violence. It is not. It is the slow undoing of ropes you tied around your own wrists. There were days when loneliness padded through the rooms like a cat you cannot coax into your lap. On those days, I practiced a small ritual. I filled a bowl with water and set a single flower afloat, then named something I had given to each of my sons that no one could return my blood. My patience, my years at the market under wet tarps, the quiet in which I learned to swallow tears. I did not do this to count debts. I did it to remind myself that love had not been wasted just because it had been misused. In the early spring, the channel grew again, and a publisher messaged to ask whether I had considered writing down my recipes and stories together. I laughed and said I had spent 40 years writing on grocery lists and backs of envelopes, that my handwriting was a battlefield. They wrote back to say that people do not buy neat lines, they buy truth. I began to draft a small book in a cheap notebook with paper that accepted ink like a blessing. Meanwhile, I kept hearing rumors from the city through people who still called cousins there that the 3 households were learning how to keep their own ledgers without penciling my name in. That the night market had found new vendors to fill the empty slot at 8:00 p.m. That children were going to school with hair combed by their fathers. The news did not please me because I wanted them to suffer. It pleased me because it suggested my leaving had not destroyed a thing, only revealed a pattern that could be redrawn. My oldest granddaughter sent a postcard from camp with a crooked sun in the corner, and her name huge across the bottom. There was no return address. but I smiled and taped it to the fridge and whispered that steady love can exist across borders when a child is permitted to write freely. In late spring, Laura came to visit. We stood in the yard by the morning glories, and she told me her own house had found a new rhythm. She had cut the schedule of favors to a sliver and reclaimed her afternoons. We did not congratulate each other as if we had outrun something terrible. We simply shared a plate of warm tortillas on the porch and let the birds do the talking. She asked, finally, whether I regretted the price. I admitted I would always carry a sorrow that my sons had not been braver husbands or kinder sons when it mattered, that my grandchildren had learned the shape of weaponized tears too young, that the word mother, once so expansive, had been made into a job title with no pension. But regret, I said, was a river I could visit without moving in. Laura squeezed my hand the way market women do when words are less efficient than heat. That summer, I planted a row of tomatoes that grew plump and split at the top with sweetness. I learned to rest at noon like the sun and work at dawn like a loyal mule. I took an old dress apart and remade it with pockets deep enough to hold a garden's worth of small harvests. I filmed the process, explaining that garments should be built like lives durable, forgiving at the seams, beautiful where it matters. Comments came from girls who had never sewn a stitch, and from grandmothers who remembered the thrum of machines in factories where they had earned their bread. Community arrived without demand. I answered as many messages as I could and let the rest go like thistle seeds on a gust. When autumn leaned in, I understood that endings can be gentle. The 3 households in the city had stopped calling the priest and the grocer to intercede. The torrent of online scolding thinned to a trickle of people who remained angry because they had confused endurance with virtue. I was no longer a story to be judged. I was simply a woman planting garlic in a line, counting cloves like rosary beads. One evening, as I brought the camera out to the porch, the sky ripened into a color I cannot write without ruining. I talked about money, though no number appeared on the screen. I explained that the first rule of dignity is that it cannot be bought back once you've sold it too many times. I spoke to the older women watching, the ones who wrote from kitchens where they were still doing every dish, every night, with the back of mind tally running like a tax meter. I told them that I had given $2,000 each month for years and 10 nights of cart earnings to each daughter-in-law and the down payments on 3 houses, and none of those gifts had been a mistake until they were expected. And an expected gift is not generosity. It is a duty someone failed to pay for in love. I reminded them to write their own names on their accounts and to buy the small thing that made them feel proud, even if it was only a bar of soap that smelled like citrus in a clean afternoon. At 7:30 p.m., I finished filming, and at 8:00 p.m., I lit a candle on the kitchen table and sat with a bowl of stew that tasted like the first winter of my youth. A message arrived from the mayor saying a community center wanted me to teach short workshops on sewing and simple cooking to teenagers who did not have grandmothers nearby. I said yes immediately. The first class arrived half shrugging, faces arranged in the adolescent mask of not caring. Within 30 minutes, they were leaning in, hands busy, eyes focused on the line where needle meets fabric. We spoke about how to fold dumplings and stitch seams and budget for groceries and, quietly, how to leave a house if your spirit grows small in it. They listened as if I had slipped them a key. That night, I walked home under a sky peppered with stars and felt something bloom in me that was neither forgiveness nor pride, only steadiness. My life had become a series of small good decisions. The final one, perhaps, would simply be to keep going. I washed the one bowl and one spoon I had used for dinner, set them to dry, and stood for a long time in the doorway to the garden where the lavender, even in the dark, held its shape. I thought of what I would tell a woman at her end of patience, that love without boundaries is only a performance. And you deserve more than applause. If you felt this story, please like to lift it up. Share it with someone who needs courage today. Subscribe for more true-to-heart life lessons, and comment where you're watching from so we can welcome you.